December the 2nd, 1993. Miguel Santos had been Pablo Escobar's most trusted informant for 3 years, the DEA agent who disappeared into the shadows of Medellín and never came back. That's exactly why the Cali cartel paid him $2 million to set up the meeting. 17 men sat around that warehouse table. Miguel walked in, nodded to Pablo, and stepped aside as the sniper's bullet found its mark. What happened in the next 3 hours rewrote the rules of the drug war. The Colombian government declared martial law. American black ops teams scrambled to contain the chaos. And for 30 years, when people talked about Pablo's final days, they never mentioned the man who made it all possible. The man who sold out the king of cocaine. The man who learned too late that some betrayals echo through generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bullet caught Pablo in the neck at 2:47 p.m. Miguel watched the blood spray across the warehouse concrete, counting heartbeats as the most wanted man in the world clutched his throat and fell sideways off his chair. 16 sicarios reached for their weapons. Miguel pressed himself against the wall, hand moving to the beretta under his jacket, not to defend Pablo, but to survive what came next. "Francotirador!" someone screamed. "Sniper!" The warehouse erupted into chaos as Escobar's men dove for cover behind overturned tables and concrete pillars. Miguel stayed frozen against the wall, watching Pablo writhe on the floor, crimson pooling beneath his white guayabera. The cartel leader's eyes found Miguel's across the chaos, wide with betrayal and recognition. He knew. Miguel's training kicked in. 3 exits, 17 armed men, 1 dying kingpin who could still give the order to kill him with a whisper. He needed to move before Pablo bled out or someone realized the sniper's bullet had come from the perfect angle, the angle Miguel had provided in yesterday's call to Cali. "Get him to the van!" Miguel shouted, rushing toward Pablo. Better to play the loyal soldier than the Judas. He knelt beside Escobar, pressing his palm against the spurting wound. The man who had built a cocaine empire worth $30 billion looked up at him with fading eyes. "You," Pablo whispered, blood bubbling on his lips. "You did this." "Save your strength, patron," Miguel said loudly enough for the others to hear. Quietly, he leaned closer. "The Americans want you alive. This wasn't supposed to happen." It was a lie. Miguel had specified the neck shot himself disable, don't kill. Pablo was worth more breathing, at least until they could extract his network's financial codes. But as Miguel watched the life draining from Colombia's most feared narco, he realized the Cali cartel had their own plans. 2 sicarios hauled Pablo upright, his blood soaking Miguel's shirt. Outside, engines roared to life, the convoy preparing to rush their dying leader to safety. Miguel followed them toward the loading dock, mind racing. If Pablo died, the Medellín cartel would tear the city apart looking for his killer. If he lived, Miguel was a dead man. The warehouse doors exploded inward. Colombian special forces poured through the breach, automatic weapons blazing. The Americans had moved faster than expected. Miguel threw himself behind a concrete barrier as bullets sparked off metal and shattered wood around him. This wasn't the plan. The extraction wasn't supposed to happen for 6 hours. "La policía!" The cry went up among Pablo's men. Some ran, others returned fire. In the confusion, Miguel saw his chance. He pulled the miniature camera from his jacket, the one the DEA had given him 18 months ago, and snapped 3 quick photos of Pablo slumped against the van's tire, blood still flowing from his neck. Evidence. Insurance. Proof that Miguel Santos had delivered the most wanted fugitive in the Western Hemisphere. "Miguel," Pablo's voice, weaker now but still carrying authority, "help me." For a moment Miguel hesitated. 3 years of deep cover. 3 years of earning this man's trust while secretly feeding intelligence to Bogotá and Washington. 3 years of watching Pablo order executions, bombings, kidnappings, all, while Miguel smiled and nodded and planned the next betrayal. But also 3 years of seeing Pablo with his children, reading bedtime stories, playing soccer in the compound's courtyard, being human in the quiet moments between the violence. The special forces closed in. Miguel made his choice. He turned and ran. Behind him, gunfire erupted as Pablo's remaining sicarios made their last stand. Miguel sprinted through the warehouse's maze of shipping containers and abandoned machinery, the photos burning in his pocket like evidence of original sin. Each step took him further from the man he'd spent 3 years pretending to be Pablo's trusted lieutenant, and closer to the truth he'd hidden even from himself. He wasn't just Miguel Santos, DEA informant. He was Miguel Santos, the man who sold his soul for $2 million in the promise that his family would be safe. The warehouse's rear exit opened onto an alley where his motorcycle waited. Miguel kicked it to life and roared into Medellin's afternoon traffic, the sound of automatic gunfire fading behind him. In 3 hours, when news of the attack broke, the city would explode. Pablo's supporters would riot. Government forces would respond with brutal efficiency. Blood would run in the streets. And somewhere in the chaos, Miguel Santos would disappear forever. He never imagined that 30 years later someone would send him those photos, the ones proving he was there, the ones that would force him to remember why his brother died 3 hours after Pablo took that bullet. The ones that would bring his carefully buried past clawing its way back into the light, hungry for the reckoning he'd spent 3 decades avoiding. But that was still 30 years away. Right now, Miguel just rode through the streets of Medellín, watching his city prepare for war. 30 years later, Miguel Santos could still feel that motorcycle beneath him in his dreams. He woke at 5:30 a.m. in his small apartment above Café Soledad, shoulder throbbing where the old bullet wound lived like a barometer of bad weather and worse memories. The Caribbean humidity seeped through the wooden shutters of his bedroom window, carrying salt air and the distant sound of fishing boats heading out from Cartagena's harbor. Miguel lay still for a moment, letting the present settle around him like a familiar blanket. The smell of yesterday's coffee grounds, the rumble of early morning traffic on the cobblestones below, the comforting weight of routine that had kept him sane for 15 years. No gunfire, no chaos, no blood pooling on warehouse concrete. Just another Tuesday in the life of a man who officially didn't exist. Miguel swung his legs over the edge of the narrow bed, joints protesting as they had every morning since he turned 50. His reflection in the cracked mirror above his dresser showed a stranger gray-haired, weathered, with kind eyes that customers trusted when they ordered their morning cortado and complained about their marriages. The face of Miguel Santos, cafe owner, bore little resemblance to the man who had once sat at Pablo Escobar's right hand. That man had been buried in Medellín 30 years ago, along with everything else Miguel loved. Downstairs, Café Soledad waited in pre-dawn darkness. Miguel flipped the switches, bringing the small space to life with warm yellow light that reflected off polished wood tables and the antique espresso machine he'd bought with the last of his DEA pension. The café occupied the ground floor of a colonial building in Cartagena's old city, its brick walls thick enough to muffle secrets and its location obscure enough that tourists rarely wandered in by accident. Miguel preferred it that way. His customers were locals, fishermen grabbing coffee before dawn, office workers reading newspapers in careful solitude, elderly women who came for the conversation as much as the café con leche. People who asked no questions about his past and accepted his carefully constructed present without scrutiny. The morning ritual began the same way it had every day for 15 years. Grind the beans, a Colombian blend that reminded him of home without the accompanying nightmares. Heat the milk to exactly 70 degrees. Arrange the chairs, wipe down the tables, unlock the front door. Simple tasks that required no moral calculations, no life or death decisions, no weighing of loyalties that could get good people killed. By 6 a.m., the first customers trickled in. Carlos, the fisherman with calloused hands, and stories about the one that got away. Maria Elena, the seamstress who always ordered her coffee bitter and black. Old Fernando, whose pension barely covered rent but whom Miguel never charged full price, though neither man acknowledged the kindness directly. "Buenos dias, Don Miguel," Maria Elena said, settling into her usual corner table with the morning paper. She was 73, widowed, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. In another life, she might have made a good intelligence officer. "Buenos dias, señora, the usual? Por favor." She studied him with the frank assessment of someone who had lived long enough to recognize trouble when it walked through her door. "You look tired today." Miguel's hand moved unconsciously to his shoulder where the old wound ached. "Just the weather." It wasn't the weather. For 3 weeks now, Miguel had felt watched. Nothing concrete, no faces in windows, no strangers lingering too long outside the café, just the prickle between his shoulder blades that had kept him alive through 3 years in Pablo's inner circle. Instinct honed by paranoia and justified by experience. He poured Maria Elena's coffee and retreated to the counter, where the routine of opening Café Soledad continued its familiar rhythm. Inventory the pastries delivered fresh from the bakery 2 blocks away. Check the register. Polish the already spotless espresso machine while watching the street through windows that reflected more than they revealed. Miguel had chosen Cartagena carefully when he disappeared from Medellín. The coastal city offered anonymity in its maze of colonial streets, far enough from the mountains where Pablo's empire had crumbled, but close enough to the ocean for quick escape if the past ever came calling. He had one bag always packed, passport and cash hidden behind a false panel in his bedroom wall, boat passage arranged with a fisherman who asked no questions because Miguel paid him enough not to care about answers. But 15 years of peace had made Miguel soft. He caught himself thinking about tomorrow's inventory instead of exit strategies, worrying about Maria Elena's cough instead of checking for surveillance. Café Soledad had become more than cover, it had become home. These people had become something dangerously close to family, which meant Miguel Santos had something to lose again. The morning passed quietly, marked by the familiar percussion of coffee cups and gentle conversation. Miguel moved through it all with practiced ease, playing his role so thoroughly he sometimes forgot it was a role at all. But underneath the comfortable routine, that old instinct whispered warnings in a voice that sounded like automatic weapons fire and dying men calling his name. Something was coming. Something that would remind him why Miguel Santos, DEA informant, had needed to die in the first place. Outside, Cartagena's morning unfolded in shades of gold and shadow, beautiful and dangerous as everything Miguel had ever loved. Miguel was cleaning the espresso machine when Carlos brought it in from the postal box outside, along with the usual collection of utility bills and advertising circulars. The fisherman's weathered hands deposited the mail on the counter without ceremony before heading to his regular table by the window, where the afternoon light caught the silver in his beard. "Anything interesting, Don Miguel?" Carlos called out, settling into his chair with the satisfied grunt of a man whose workday was finished. "Just the electric bill," Miguel replied, but his eyes remained fixed on the manila envelope. No postmark he could identify. No stamp, hand-delivered then, which meant someone had found Café Soledad specifically. Someone who knew exactly where to look for a man who was supposed to be dead. The weight of 15 years' peace suddenly felt as fragile as the tissue paper wrapped around whatever lay inside. Miguel's hands moved with practiced calm as he finished cleaning the machine, muscle memory taking over while his mind calculated distances to exits and the location of the Beretta still hidden behind the false panel upstairs. The afternoon crowd was thin, just Carlos, Maria Elena with her eternal crossword puzzle, and a young couple sharing a dessert in the corner. Civilians, people who didn't deserve to be caught in crossfire if his past had finally tracked him down. "Don Miguel?" Maria Elena's voice carried concern. "You look pale. Just tired, Senora." Miguel forced a smile, wiping his hands on the towel. "This humidity, you know." But Maria Elena's sharp eyes missed nothing, and Miguel saw recognition flicker across her weathered features, not of who he was, but of what he was. A man carrying weight that had nothing to do with age or weather. She folded her newspaper and gathered her purse with the deliberate movements of someone who understood when to make herself scarce. "I should head home," she announced to no one in particular. "My novella starts soon." Carlos grunted agreement and followed her lead, leaving exact change on his table before disappearing into the late afternoon heat. The young couple seemed absorbed in each other, but Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that the man's casual glances toward the counter were anything but casual. Miguel waited until they left before turning the sign to Cerrado and locking the front door. His hands remained steady as he picked up the envelope, though the familiar weight of dread settled in his chest like an old enemy returning home. 30 years of running, 15 years of peace, and it all came down to this moment in a small cafe where he'd convinced himself he could forget what Miguel Santos had done to survive. Inside the envelope were 3 photographs, each one a perfectly focused window into the past he'd buried. The first showed Pablo Escobar slumped against the van's tire, blood streaming from the neck wound that should have killed him but didn't. The second captured the chaos of the warehouse as Colombian special forces breached the doors, muzzle flashes frozen like deadly fireworks in the afternoon gloom. The third was the worst, Pablo's face in close-up, eyes wide with pain and betrayal, looking directly at the camera, looking directly at Miguel, because Miguel had taken these pictures. Miguel had stood over the most wanted man in the world, snapping evidence while Pablo bled out, collecting insurance against the day when someone might question his loyalty to the badge he carried or the country he served. The photos had disappeared into a DEA evidence locker 30 years ago, sealed with classifications that should have kept them buried until every player in Colombia's drug wars was dead and forgotten. But here they were, perfect prints on glossy paper, as clear as the day he'd taken them. Someone knew. Someone had access to files that required presidential clearance to open. Someone who could trace Miguel Santos from Medellín to Cartagena, from DEA informant to cafe owner, from the man who'd helped bring down Pablo Escobar to the ghost who'd been hiding in plain sight for 3 decades. Miguel's shoulder erupted in pain as if the old bullet wound could sense the approaching storm. His hands shook as he turned the first photograph over, knowing he would find something written there but hoping desperately that he was wrong. 4 words in careful block letters: "We need to talk." The handwriting was feminine, precise and familiar in a way that made Miguel's blood turn to ice water in his veins. He knew that script, had seen it on birthday cards and grocery lists and the note she'd left explaining why she couldn't wait for him to choose between his family and his mission. Elena, his wife, his dead wife, the woman who'd died in a car bombing 3 hours after Pablo took that bullet, killed by cartel soldiers looking for leverage against the traitor in their midst. The woman he'd buried 15 years ago, along with everything else he'd loved and lost. But dead women didn't send photographs. Dead women didn't track down ghosts in coastal cities. Dead women didn't know where to find coffee shops that served as graveyards for inconvenient identities, which meant Miguel Santos had been living a lie for longer than he'd ever imagined. Miguel's hands had betrayed him in the moment he needed them most, sending the images spinning through the air to land face-up on tiles he'd mopped 10,000 times. Pablo's blood looked fresh under the fluorescent lights, as if 30 years had collapsed into nothing and the warehouse was here, now, bleeding into his sanctuary. He left them there and backed away from the counter until his shoulders hit the espresso machine, its familiar weight the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned liquid. The machine's warmth seeped through his shirt, real heat, real metal, real enough to anchor him while everything else dissolved into the impossibility of Elena's handwriting. Focus. Miguel forced his breathing to slow, drawing on training that had kept him alive when men with automatic weapons were actively hunting him. Process the data, calculate the threat, stay functional. But the data made no sense. Elena Restrepo Santos had died in a car bombing on March 15, 1993. Miguel knew because he'd identified her body, or what remained of it, in the Medellín morgue. He'd arranged the funeral, stood in the rain while they lowered her casket, and spent the next 2 weeks drinking himself, unconscious, because living hurt too much and dying seemed too easy. The bombing had been retaliation for Pablo's shooting. Cartel soldiers working their way through anyone connected to the warehouse, looking for the informant who'd set up their leader. Elena's death was collateral damage in a war Miguel had started but couldn't control, one more innocent life sacrificed on the altar of his divided loyalties. Except, Miguel crouched slowly and picked up the photograph showing Pablo's face. His wife's handwriting on the back seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. "We need to talk." The letters were exactly as he remembered. The way she dotted her I's with tiny circles, the slight backward slant that spoke of left-handed adaptation to a right-handed world. Dead women didn't write notes, but someone who knew Elena intimately might be able to forge her handwriting. Someone who'd had access to her personal papers, her letters, the grocery lists she'd left magneted to their refrigerator in the little house where they'd pretended to be normal. Someone who'd been close enough to know details that never made it into official files. Miguel's mind began building scenarios the way it had during his informant years, when survival depended on seeing 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Possibility 1, Elena had somehow survived the bombing, lived in hiding for 30 years, and was now making contact. Impossible. Miguel had seen the body, identified the wedding ring he'd placed on her finger 7 years earlier. Possibility 2, someone with access to Elena's possessions and intimate knowledge of her habits was using her memory as leverage. Possible, but that required planning spanning decades and resources Miguel couldn't identify. Possibility 3, the bombing had been staged. Elena's death fabricated to protect her while Miguel took the blame for the warehouse operation. Miguel's hands clenched involuntarily, shoulder wound flaring as if his body remembered truths his mind refused to process. But that would mean... The cafe's phone rang, its shrill voice cutting through silence thick enough to drown in. Miguel stared at it for 3 rings before his training overrode his paralysis. He picked up the receiver with hands that had found their steadiness again, though his voice came out rougher than intended. Café Soledad. Silence. then breathing careful, controlled, distinctly feminine. "Hello, Miguel?" The voice carried traces of an accent he'd once known better than his own heartbeat. Older now, weathered by decades of whatever life she'd been living while he grieved for her death. "I see you found my photographs." Miguel's throat felt lined with broken glass. "Elena, you sound surprised. Didn't you always tell me you were too smart to believe everything you saw?" A pause filled with 30 years of unasked questions. "We really do need to talk. You're dead." The words came out automatically, a statement of fact his mind still insisted was true despite the evidence breathing through the phone line. "So are you, according to the files. Miguel Santos died in a car accident outside Medellín in 1995. Very sad, very convenient." Her laugh carried no humor, just recognition of shared deception. "But here we both are, playing cafe owner and ghost." Through the locked door's glass, Miguel watched afternoon shadows lengthen across Cartagena's cobblestones. Normal life continuing its normal rhythm while his world cracked apart like poorly mortared brick. A woman walked past with groceries. Children played soccer in the plaza, none of them aware that the dead had started talking again. "What do you want?" Miguel asked, though part of him dreaded any answer she might give. "I want to save your life," Elena said, "because the people who've been looking for us just found your cafe, and they're not interested in talking." The line went dead, leaving Miguel alone with photographs of the past and the terrible certainty that his 15 years of peace had just become 15 years of borrowed time. Outside, a black sedan pulled up across the street. Miguel stepped away from the window, photographs crunching under his feet. Pablo's blood-soaked face stared up at him from the floor, a reminder that even the most powerful men bled the same color when their past came calling. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 15 years mopping these tiles, keeping them spotless, and now they were contaminated with evidence of every choice that had brought him here. The cafe felt smaller suddenly, walls pressing inward like a confession booth designed for sinners who'd run out of absolution. Miguel moved through the space with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from his DEA years taking over. Lock the back door, check the register, 300,000 pesos, enough for immediate expenses. Grab the emergency bag from behind the false panel upstairs. But his feet wouldn't carry him toward the stairs. Instead, he found himself standing over the photographs, studying them with the detached analysis of a man who'd learned to compartmentalize horror. The warehouse shooting hadn't been random. Miguel knew that now, had always known it if he was honest. Someone had orchestrated Pablo's near death, used Miguel's position to set up the meeting, then disappeared while Medellín burned. Elena's voice echoed in his memory. "The people who've been looking for us, not him, not us." Which meant she'd been running too, hiding from the same forces that had turned Miguel Santos into a ghost. The same forces now sitting across the street in a sedan that cost more than most Colombians made in 5 years. Miguel crouched and gathered the photographs, his shoulders screaming protest. The pain felt appropriate penance for believing he could bury the past without paying compound interest on 30 years of silence. Elena had tried to warn him, called to save his life, and he'd wasted precious minutes processing impossibilities instead of moving toward survival. But Elena had been dead for 30 years. Miguel had held her cold hand in the morgue, kissed her forehead one last time before they zipped the body bag. The woman on the phone might share Elena's voice, her handwriting, her intimate knowledge of their marriage, but the dead didn't make phone calls, unless they did. Unless Miguel Santos had been living in a world built on lies so fundamental he'd never thought to question them. Unless the car bombing that killed his wife had been as carefully staged as Pablo's shooting, designed to remove a player from the board while everyone else fought over the visible pieces. The sedan's doors opened. 3 men emerged with the coordinated precision of a unit that had worked together before. The driver remained by the vehicle escape route secured. The passenger moved toward the cafe's front entrance, while the third circled toward the alley behind the building. Standard tactical approach for contained extraction. Miguel's Beretta waited upstairs, cleaned and loaded but 15 years removed from his grip. By the time he reached it, they'd have the building surrounded. By the time he decided whether to fight or run, they'd be inside his sanctuary, contaminating the only clean space he'd managed to create since Elena's death. Elena's false death. The realization hit him like a bullet to the chest. Not the sharp crack of impact, but the slow, spreading burn of damaged tissue trying to process trauma. If Elena was alive, if she'd been hidden away while he grieved, then someone had orchestrated her disappearance. Someone with resources to fake forensic evidence, influence morgue workers, and maintain the deception for 3 decades. Someone who'd needed Miguel to believe she was dead. But why? What was worth destroying a man's faith in his own grief, his own memories of loss? What secret was so dangerous that it required not just Elena's disappearance, but Miguel's complete ignorance of her survival? The front door's glass reflected the approaching figure, tall, lean, wearing a suit too expensive for Cartagena's heat. Miguel recognized the walk before he saw the face, the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to compliance. The man's hand rested casually near his jacket's opening, ready but not threatening. Yet, Miguel's phone buzzed once text message. He glanced down at the screen and saw a number he didn't recognize. Back door. Now. Trust me like you used to, Elena. Miguel stared at the message until the words burned themselves into his retinas. Trust me like you used to. Before the warehouse. Before Pablo's blood on his hands and her body in the morgue. Before Miguel Santos learned that love was just another kind of ammunition in wars where civilians didn't exist. The suited man reached the cafe's front door and tested the handle. Finding it locked, he produced something from his pocket lockpicks probably, though Miguel didn't wait to confirm. He moved toward the back of the cafe, stepping over scattered photographs that had once been his insurance policy, and were now evidence of his naivete. Trust, the most dangerous word in any language. But 15 years of peace had just ended, and the dead were calling his name. Get on. The voice was Elena's, muffled by the visor but unmistakably hers. Same cadence, same authority that had once convinced him to quit smoking and take the Medellín assignment. The assignment that had destroyed everything they'd built together. Miguel hesitated, hand instinctively moving toward where his service weapon should have been. Prove you're real. The rider reached up and lifted the visor. Even through 30 years of distance and dim light, Elena's eyes were exactly as he remembered, green flecked with gold, intelligent and fierce, and completely unforgiving. But the face around them had aged into something harder than memory allowed. Lines carved by decades of deception, scars Miguel didn't recognize, and a coldness that made his chest ache with recognition. She looked like him now, like someone who'd learned to kill parts of herself to survive. You had a nightmare every Tuesday for 3 months after the warehouse, Elena said quietly. Always the same dream, Pablo's blood on your hands while I bled out in our kitchen. You'd wake up screaming my name and spend the rest of the night cleaning your gun. She paused, studying his face for recognition. Real enough, Miguel? Behind them, glass shattered as the cafe's front door gave way. Professional voices called out in accented Spanish-Venezuelan, maybe Argentinian. Men who'd crossed borders to be here, which meant resources and patience and very specific orders about what to do with retired DEA operatives who knew too much about ancient history. Miguel swung his leg over the motorcycle, settling against Elena's back like a memory made flesh. She felt real warm, solid, breathing. But then, hallucinations probably felt real too when your world collapsed in the space of an afternoon. The bike lunged forward into Cartagena's maze of colonial streets, Elena navigating with the confidence of someone who'd studied the terrain. Miguel's arms encircled her waist automatically, muscle memory from 1,000 rides when they'd been young and stupid and convinced their love could survive anything the world threw at them. Where have you been? Miguel shouted over the engine noise. Dead, Elena called back. Like you should have been. The motorcycle carved through evening traffic, past vendors closing their stalls and tourists stumbling between bars, everyone blissfully unaware that ghosts were racing through their postcard paradise. Miguel caught glimpses of pursuit in storefront windows, the black sedan weaving through cars 2 blocks behind them, gaining ground despite Elena's reckless cornering. They burst onto the Malecon, the Caribbean stretching before them like an escape route to nowhere. Elena gunned the engine, and Miguel felt gravity's brief release as they sailed over a speed bump that should have launched them into the sea. Instead, they landed hard and kept moving, Elena's laugh cutting through wind and exhaust like a blade. That laugh. Miguel remembered it from their honeymoon, from lazy Sunday mornings, from the night she'd told him about the pregnancy they'd lost 6 months later. But this version carried something else: satisfaction, as if she'd been waiting 30 years to feel this alive again. Who were those men? Miguel asked as Elena took them down a side street that led away from the water. People who want their photographs back. Elena's voice carried amusement that chilled him. People who thought they'd buried all the witnesses. What photographs? I took those pictures for evidence, Elena. They disappeared into DEA files. You didn't take those pictures for the DEA, Miguel. Elena's voice cut through his protests like ice through skin. You took them for me. The motorcycle slowed as they entered a neighborhood Miguel didn't recognize. Colonial buildings giving way to newer construction that spoke of money and careful planning. Elena guided them into an underground garage beneath a building that looked abandoned but felt anything but empty. Miguel's world tilted as memory and reality collided in ways that made breathing difficult. What are you talking about? Elena killed the engine and pulled off her helmet, hair spilling over shoulders that were broader than he remembered, more muscular. When she turned to face him, her smile held no warmth whatsoever. The warehouse wasn't about capturing Pablo, Miguel. It was about making sure he survived long enough to identify his real enemies. Elena's eyes gleamed with 30 years of carefully hoarded truth. Pablo was never supposed to die that day. He was supposed to see your face behind the camera and remember it when he woke up in that hospital bed. Miguel felt the ground disappear beneath him as understanding crashed over him like a collapsing building. You set me up. I saved your life by giving you something more valuable than love, Elena said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a long game finally reaching checkmate. I gave you a reason to run so far and hide so deep that even I couldn't find you. Until now. The truth hit him like Pablo's bullet should have, clean, precise, and absolutely fatal to everything he'd believed about himself. 30 years, he said, the words scraping against his throat like broken concrete. 30 years I mourned you. I visited your grave every month until I couldn't anymore. I kept your coffee cup on the kitchen counter for 2 years because washing it felt like murder. Elena stepped away from the bike, her movements predatory in a way that made Miguel's training instincts flare. She'd always been graceful, but this was different, calculated, weaponized. 30 years had turned his wife into something that wore her face but moved like a stranger. I know, her voice carried no apology, just acknowledgement of damage assessed and accepted. I watched you sometimes, from a distance. You grieved beautifully, Miguel, very convincing. The casual cruelty of it struck him like a physical blow. You watched me? While I was destroying myself, you were what, taking notes? I was staying alive long enough to finish what we started. Elena moved to a workbench against the far wall, her back to him as she sorted through items Miguel couldn't identify. The warehouse operation wasn't blown, Miguel. It worked exactly as designed. Pablo lived, you escaped with evidence that would eventually surface, and everyone else got to play their assigned roles in a very necessary theater. Miguel finally stood, legs unsteady but functional. The garage smelled of motor oil and old concrete, familiar scents that reminded him of DEA safe houses and midnight briefings. Theater? Elena, people died. Real people. Your brother was expendable. She turned back to face him, and Miguel saw his wife's features arranged around a stranger's soul. Rodrigo knew the risks when he agreed to drive you to the warehouse. He also knew why it mattered. The words hit Miguel like ice water. Elena's brother had been collateral damage, caught in the crossfire when cartel soldiers raided his garage looking for Miguel. Another innocent life sacrificed to Miguel's failures as an informant. Another ghost that haunted his dreams. Except Rodrigo hadn't been innocent. According to Elena, he'd been complicit. How many people were part of this, Miguel asked, though he dreaded the answer. Everyone who needed to be. Elena picked up something from the workbench, a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. Your handler at DEA, Pablo's security chief who arranged the warehouse meeting, the morgue technician who certified my death, the cartel soldiers who conveniently missed you when they raided the safe house. She smiled, and Miguel recognized the expression from their early years together. Elena planning surprise birthday parties or weekend getaways, orchestrating joy with the same methodical precision she'd apparently applied to orchestrating his destruction. But why? The question came out as a whisper, all his strength focused on remaining vertical while his worldview collapsed. If you needed me gone, why not just disappear? Why make me believe you were dead? Because grief makes people careful, Elena said, setting the folder on the bike seat between them like evidence in a trial where Miguel was both defendant and jury. Guilty men run in patterns, they use old contacts, fall back on familiar resources, make mistakes that get them caught. But a grieving widower, she shrugged. A man mourning his wife's death doesn't think like an operative. He thinks like a victim. He builds a small, quiet life and tends it like a garden because he's afraid to want anything more. The truth of it was suffocating. 15 years running a cafe, serving coffee to tourists and locals, keeping his head down and his past buried. 15 years of careful mediocrity designed to honor Elena's memory by becoming invisible. 15 years of being exactly where she'd wanted him. The photographs, Miguel said, understanding finally beginning to coalesce like blood around a wound. You sent them to flush me out. I sent them because our enemies finally found us, both of us. Elena's facade cracked slightly, revealing something that might have been genuine concern. The warehouse operation wasn't about Pablo, Miguel. It was about documenting something much bigger, something that's been growing in the shadows for 3 decades using Pablo's myth as cover. She opened the folder and pulled out a photograph Miguel had never seen before the warehouse from a different angle, showing figures he hadn't noticed 30 years ago. Men in expensive suits watching from the shadows while Miguel photographed Pablo's bleeding form. Men whose faces were clearer in this shot, identifiable. Pablo was small time compared to what came after, Elena continued. The cartels evolved, Miguel. They got smart, went legitimate, bought politicians and judges and police chiefs. But they kept one weakness: they needed to eliminate everyone who witnessed their early operations. Everyone who could identify the architects. Miguel stared at the photograph, recognition dawning like nausea. One of the faces belonged to a man he'd seen on Colombian news broadcasts, a senator known for his anti-drug stance. Another belonged to someone he'd glimpsed in the cafe just last week, a well-dressed customer who'd ordered cortado and asked too many casual questions about Miguel's past. They've been hunting us for 30 years, Elena said softly, and now they've found us both. Outside, engines rumbled to life. Found us? Miguel's voice cracked like ice under pressure. Elena, I've been hiding in plain sight for 15 years. You're the one who... The realization hit him with devastating clarity. You led them here. Elena's expression shifted, mask finally slipping to reveal something raw underneath. Not the cold operative who'd orchestrated his exile, but someone desperate and cornered. I had to. They have our daughter, Miguel. The garage tilted around him. Our daughter is dead. Miscarriage at 6 months. I held your hand in that hospital room while I gave birth to a living child and let you believe otherwise. Elena's voice broke on the words, 30 years of buried truth finally surfacing. Catalina is 29 years old. She works as a journalist in Bogotá, investigating corruption in the pharmaceutical industry. Last week, she published an article about money laundering through medical supply companies. Yesterday, they took her. Elena nodded toward a service tunnel partially hidden behind stacked equipment. Leads to the building next door, but Miguel... She stopped, something in her expression shifting. For a moment, she looked like the woman he'd married, vulnerable and fierce and absolutely certain of what mattered most. What? I never stopped loving you. The words came out rushed, desperate. Everything I did, every lie I told it was to keep you and Catalina alive. I need you to know that before what? But Miguel already knew. Elena's hand position, the way she'd positioned herself between Miguel and the tunnel entrance, the careful distance she'd maintained throughout their reunion. Elena, no. Someone has to stay to convince them you escaped alone. Her smile held echoes of the woman who'd once promised to grow old with him. Someone has to buy enough time for you to find our daughter and finish what we started. The garage door exploded inward. Tactical lights pierced the fluorescent gloom as armed figures poured through the entrance. Miguel saw Elena's finger tighten on her trigger, saw the acceptance in her eyes as she prepared to die for real this time. But 30 years of rage and grief and betrayal had crystallized into something harder than Elena's martyrdom complex. Miguel grabbed her wrist, spinning her toward the tunnel as he opened fire on the advancing figures. We both live, he snarled, pushing her toward escape. We both find our daughter, and then we both finish this together. For the first time in 30 years, Elena Santos looked genuinely surprised. They ran toward the tunnel as bullets chewed through concrete around them, the dead finally choosing to stay alive. They emerged into another basement, this one belonging to a textile warehouse that had seen better decades. Elena moved with certainty through the maze of abandoned machinery, leading him to a service elevator that groaned upward like the city's dying breath. When the doors opened onto street level, Cartagena's evening heat hit them like a wall of memory and regret. My truck, Elena said, pointing to a battered Ford parked between 2 vendor stalls. The owner of the arepa stand watched them with careful indifference, the kind of deliberate blindness that money purchased in neighborhoods where questions were expensive luxuries. They drove in silence through streets Miguel no longer recognized, past construction sites and new hotels that had sprouted where old families once lived. The Cartagena of his exile was disappearing, replaced by something shinier and more profitable. Even his ghosts were being gentrified. She looks like you, Elena said finally as they reached the coastal highway. Catalina, same stubborn jaw, same way of listening like she's cataloging evidence. Miguel stared out at the Caribbean, its surface reflecting lights from cruise ships and container vessels. All those years serving coffee to strangers, he'd wondered what their child might have become. Now he knew, and the knowledge felt like swallowing broken glass. 29 years, he said. Did she ever ask about her father? Every day until she turned 16. Then she stopped asking and started investigating. Elena's smile carried equal parts pride and regret. She found your DEA records 3 years ago, figured out you were still alive about 6 months after that. The words hit him like vertigo. She knows? She knows Miguel Santos died in a warehouse in Medellín and was reborn running a cafe in Cartagena. She knows her father was either a hero or a traitor, depending on whose story you believe. Elena glanced at him as she navigated around a slower truck. She doesn't know which version she wants to meet. They drove through the night, heading inland toward mountains that held their own catalog of secrets and scars. Elena had safe houses, plural, scattered across 2 countries. Resources accumulated over 3 decades of staying dead while building something larger than survival. As dawn painted the eastern peaks, they stopped at a farmhouse that looked abandoned but felt carefully maintained. Elena produced keys and led him inside, where Miguel discovered a command center that would have impressed his old handlers at DEA. Computers, communication equipment, surveillance monitors showing feeds from cameras positioned around the property's perimeter. How long have you been planning this reunion? Miguel asked, studying photographs tacked to a bulletin board, images of cartel leaders, politicians, businessmen, all connected by red string that mapped a conspiracy spanning 3 decades. Since the day I realized they'd never stop hunting us. Elena moved to a coffee maker that looked newer than anything else in the room. Want some? I know you still take it black. Miguel accepted the cup, inhaling steam that smelled like home and deception. The photographs you sent to the cafe, you knew what they'd do to me. I knew they'd force you to become Miguel Santos again instead of the ghost who served coffee to tourists. Elena settled across from him at a table covered with maps and dossiers. Our daughter needs her father, Miguel, not the broken man hiding in Cartagena, but the operative who got close enough to photograph Pablo Escobar's blood. Outside, birds were singing ordinary sounds from an ordinary morning that felt like the end of the world. Miguel studied Elena's face, cataloging changes that 30 years had carved into features he'd once memorized. Crow's feet that spoke of tension rather than laughter. Scars along her jawline that suggested violence survived. Hands that moved with the economy of someone who'd learned to waste nothing, not words, not gestures, not opportunities to stay alive. I don't know how to forgive you, Miguel said finally. I don't know how to forgive myself. Elena's response came without hesitation. But forgiveness is a luxury we can afford after we get our daughter back. Miguel sipped his coffee and watched the sun climb over mountains that had witnessed too much history. Somewhere in those peaks, Pablo Escobar had hidden from justice. Somewhere in those valleys, Miguel had learned that love and betrayal were often the same words spoken in different tones. When we find her, Miguel said, when we finish this, what then? Elena's smile carried the weight of 30 years' worth of carefully hoarded hope. Then we find out if 3 people who barely know each other can learn to be a family. Miguel nodded, understanding finally settling over him like sunrise over scarred landscape. Some stories ended with justice, others ended with revenge, but this one might end with something harder and more valuable. The possibility of redemption earned through blood, forgiveness, and the stubborn refusal to let the dead stay buried. They had a daughter to save. They had a war to finish. They had a lifetime of damage to repair, one honest conversation at a time.